On October 14, 2014, a heavy iron tailgate dropped open with a metallic clang that echoed off the sheer, vertical walls of a forgotten canyon in the high desert of the American West. The air was bone dry, thick with the scent of sagebrush and fine, powdery dust that had not been disturbed for decades. Out of the darkness of that livestock trailer stepped 15 wild horses. They were lean, battle-scarred, and deeply distrustful of human hands. Animals that had been gathered from overpopulated public lands and faced an uncertain future in crowded federal holding pens. Now they were being pushed into a barren, forgotten chasm known to locals as Dead Canyon. The odds stacked against them were almost total. This was a landscape broken by time and human error. There was no visible standing water, no lush meadows, and no shelter from the scorching desert sun or the sub-zero winter winds that tore through the gorge. Wildlife biologists and local ranchers openly criticized the project, predicting a grim and swift conclusion. They argued that within weeks, these 15 animals would either starve, perish from dehydration, or be systematically hunted down by the mountain lions that stalked the rocky rims. It was viewed by many as a cruel experiment, a dump site for animals nobody wanted, in a place where nothing could survive. Nobody expected what came next. But that is not the story. The 15 horses did not wander aimlessly until they collapsed into the dust. They did not succumb to the predators, nor did they wither away under the relentless desert sun. Instead, what those 15 animals did inside that isolated canyon over the next decade completely rewrote the textbook on North American ecology. They did something so profoundly transformative, so utterly outside the known scope of equine behavior, that it stunned the scientific community and changed the way we view the natural world forever. This is the untold story of an impossible ecological resurrection. First, we will examine how this ancient canyon was stripped of its life and pushed to the brink of total collapse. Then, we will look at the desperate, highly controversial gamble to release a small band of unwanted horses into the wasteland. And finally, we will uncover the shocking, unscripted phenomenon that occurred when these animals began to reshape the very geology of the earth beneath their hooves, a twist that absolutely nobody saw coming. To truly understand what these 15 horses accomplished, you have to understand the true nature of the animal itself. In modern times, we look at the horse and we see a beast of burden, a companion, or an icon of Western romance. But it is not just a grazer, it is a landscape architect. Millions of years before the first humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge, the evolutionary ancestors of the modern horse were running across the vast plains of North America. They evolved alongside this continent's grasses, its soils, and its climate. Their entire anatomy is a masterclass in deep time adaptation, fine-tuned to survive in environments where resources are devastatingly scarce. Consider the horse's hoof. It is not merely a fingernail or a passive block of keratin. It is a dynamic, highly specialized tool. When a horse moves, the flexible heel of the hoof compresses against the ground, acting as a secondary pump that forces blood back up the leg, conserving cardiac energy. The sharpness of that hoof is capable of breaking through iron-hard permafrost, crusty snow, and baked clay. Furthermore, unlike ruminants like cattle or deer, which possess a multi-chambered stomach that meticulously breaks down every ounce of fiber, the horse is a cecal digester. It processes food rapidly and inefficiently. This sounds like an evolutionary disadvantage, but in reality, it is a superpower. A horse can consume high-volume, low-quality, coarse forage, the tough, fibrous grasses that other animals ignore, and pass the seeds through its digestive tract entirely intact, encased in a rich, mobile fertilizer. For thousands of generations, these animals acted as the pulse of the North American grassland. They moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to overgraze, their heavy tracks breaking up the hard crust of the earth, allowing rainwater to penetrate deep into the soil rather than washing away in destructive flash floods. They were the ultimate seed dispersers, the caretakers of the prairie. But then, approximately 10,000 years ago, at the end of the Pleistocene epoch, they vanished from their homeland, likely due to a combination of rapid climate shifts and overhunting by early human arrivals. The landscape they left behind never truly forgot them. The soil, the plants, and the deep aquifers remained evolutionary matches for a heavy, fast-moving, single-toed herbivore. When Dead Canyon was stripped of its native species and colonized by modern industries in the late 19th century, that ancient balance was completely shattered. The canyon had once been an oasis, a hidden green ribbon cutting through hundreds of miles of arid sagebrush desert. Historically, a perennial creek meandered through the canyon floor, shaded by ancient groves of cottonwood and willow trees. It was a haven for mule deer, bighorn sheep, and hundreds of species of migratory birds. But the arrival of intensive cattle ranching changed everything. Unlike the ancient horse, cattle tend to congregate in low-lying riparian areas. They do not like to climb steep canyon walls or travel miles away from water. They stay by the creek, trampling the fragile banks, eating the young willow shoots down to the nub, and compacting the moist soil until it becomes as hard as concrete. In 1953, a well-meaning but catastrophic human decision sealed the canyon's fate. Local water managers constructed a concrete diversion dam upstream, designed to redirect the canyon's seasonal flow toward agricultural valleys miles away. The result was an ecological disaster. Deprived of its natural water cycle and pulverized by decades of overgrazing, the canyon began a rapid, agonizing descent into desertification. The water table plunged dozens of feet below the surface. Without the roots of young willows and cottonwoods to hold the banks together, the first major summer flash flood acted like a chainsaw. It gouged out the creek bed, dropping it into a 30-foot deep, vertical-walled trench known as an arroyo. The water could no longer spill over onto the floodplain to nourish the valley floor. Instead, any rain that fell rushed through the canyon like a freight train through a concrete pipe, leaving the land drier than before. The cascade effect was devastating. The ancient cottonwoods, unable to reach the receding water table, died where they stood, turning into grey, brittle skeletons. The willow flycatchers and songbirds disappeared. The soil, stripped of its organic matter, became hydrophobic. It literally repelled water. When rain hit the ground, it could not penetrate the surface. It simply washed away the remaining topsoil, leaving behind nothing but boulders, gravel, and an invasive, highly flammable weed known as cheatgrass. By the dawn of the 21st century, Dead Canyon lived up to its name. It was silent, scorched, and universally abandoned. It was a place where ecosystems went to die. Then came an unexpected turn of events. In the hot summer of 2011, a wildlife biologist named Dr. Sarah Vance was conducting an aerial survey of bighorn sheep populations in the remote corners of the state. As the helicopter banked sharply over the rugged rims of Dead Canyon, she looked down and noticed something strange in a deeply isolated, completely inaccessible pocket of the gorge. It was a tiny patch of bright, vibrant emerald green, completely surrounded by miles of grey dust and dead brush. Intrigued, Dr. Vance returned on foot, embarking on a grueling 2-day hike through treacherous terrain to reach the canyon floor. What she found was a geological anomaly. Deep beneath the surface, a massive sheet of impervious volcanic rock had forced a tiny, microscopic remnant of an ancient aquifer close to the canyon floor. There was no open water, no pools, no streams, but the mud just a few feet beneath the gravel was damp. It was a secret reservoir of life, completely locked away under feet of baked clay and heavy stone, utterly inaccessible to any native wildlife or domestic stock. When she presented her findings to conservation boards and federal land managers, an intense, bitter debate erupted. Dr. Vance proposed an audacious, highly experimental idea. Introduce a small test population of wild horses into the canyon. The backlash was immediate. Cattle groups argued that horses would ruin what little forage was left. Traditional conservationists argued that horses were an exotic, invasive species that did not belong in a fragile desert ecosystem. They argued over costs, risks, and political optics. They said the horses would destroy the canyon completely or starve to death in plain view of the public. But Dr. Vance held her ground. She argued that the canyon was already ecologically dead, and standard restoration techniques, which would require millions of dollars, heavy machinery, and decades of human labor, were physically impossible due to the rugged, inaccessible terrain. "We need an animal that can work for free," she argued. "We need an animal that has the physical power to break this landscape open." After 3 years of bureaucratic red tape, a compromise was reached. The state granted permission for a one-time, highly monitored release of just 15 wild horses. These were not prize animals. They were unadoptable stallions and mares from a government holding facility, animals that had spent months standing on gravel lots, destined to live out their lives in captivity. The logistics of the release mirrored a high-stakes military operation. Because no roads led into the heart of the canyon, the horses had to be transported in heavy stock trailers, pulled by modified high-clearance tractors over miles of trackless boulders and steep switchbacks. When the trailers finally reached the drop-off point, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The handlers pulled the pins, the doors swung open, and the 15 horses bolted out into the blinding canyon light. They did not look back. They ran until they disappeared into the labyrinth of dust and stone. The human teams packed up their equipment and left, many believing they would return in the spring only to collect bones. The first winter of 2015 was brutal. A severe polar vortex slammed into the region, dropping temperatures inside the canyon to a catastrophic -25 degrees Fahrenheit. Blizzards dumped 4 feet of heavy, dense snow into the gorge, trapping the horses inside the steep vertical walls. The threats to their survival were intensely real, but they were never the headline. While humans worried about their survival, the horses were relying on an ancient playbook written into their DNA. When the heavy snow blocked access to the dry cheatgrass on the canyon floor, the horses did not freeze. They used their heavy, muscular chests to plow through the drifts, and their sharp hooves to chop through the thick ice sheets that covered the ground, exposing the dormant forage beneath. When a pack of apex predators, 7 timber wolves that had drifted down from the northern mountains, attempted to corner a young mare against the canyon wall, the horses did not scatter as cattle would. Instead, the dominant stallion, a battle-scarred bay with a notched ear, led the herd into a tight defensive circle. They formed a literal wall of muscle and bone, facing inward to protect the vulnerable, while their powerful hind legs kicked outward with lethal force. The wolves, realizing the immense risk of injury, backed away into the shadows. The horses had survived their first test. But it was what they did when the snow melted that began to fundamentally shift the reality of the canyon. As the scorching heat of the summer of 2016 arrived, the temperature on the canyon floor soared past 105 degrees. The temporary snowmelt pools dried up completely. The land became an oven. Any other domestic animal would have walked along the fence lines until they dropped from dehydration. But these horses possessed an extraordinary behavioral quirk that scientists are only now beginning to fully understand. They began to dig. Led by an older, experienced alpha mare, the horses moved to the exact spot where Dr. Vance had discovered the hidden subsurface moisture years prior. Using their front hooves like heavy hoes, they began to systematically strike the baked clay earth. They chopped at the rocks, scooping out the gravel with backward strokes of their legs. They worked in shifts, digging deeper and deeper into the dry creek bed. Within 48 hours, they had excavated a series of deep, circular wells, some reaching nearly 4 feet below the surface. And then the miracle happened. Water, cool, clear, filtered by feet of sand and gravel, began to slowly seep up from the hidden volcanic aquifer, filling the bottoms of the horse-carved wells. The horses had unlocked the canyon's deep, secret reservoir. The ripple effect of this single behavioral adaptation was immediate and staggering. These wells were not just watering holes for the horses. They became the life support system for the entire canyon ecosystem. Because the horses constantly cleared the sand and maintained the wells, the water remained accessible throughout the driest months of the year. Camera traps set up by Dr. Vance's research team captured mind-blowing footage. At night, when the horses moved up to the cooler canyon rims to graze, a secret parade of wildlife descended into the wells. Mule deer, badgers, desert kit foxes, and bobcats drank from the horse wells. Flocks of sage grouse and rare migratory songbirds converged on the oasis, drawing hydration from a landscape that had been dry for half a century. Even the native amphibians, spadefoot toads that had lain dormant in the baked mud for years, waiting for a rain that never came, emerged to breed in the shallow, standing water of the overflow pools. The horses were no longer just inhabitants of the canyon, they were actively engineering its survival. As the years rolled on, the data began to reflect a triumph that defied every cynical prediction. In 2014, the starting population was 15. By 2018, despite the predators and the harsh winters, the herd had naturally and sustainably grown to 34 healthy individuals. By 2022, that number had reached 78. Today, in 2026, more than 140 wild horses roam the vast, rugged expanse of the canyon system, an area now encompassing a pristine wilderness zone larger than the entire island of Manhattan. The hard numbers gathered by satellite imagery and ground surveys paint a stunning picture of ecological recovery. Total vegetation cover within the canyon floor has increased by an astonishing 420% since the horses arrived. The deep, eroded arroyos, those 30-foot deep scars left by decades of human error, have begun to heal. Because the horses graze heavily on the invasive, highly flammable cheatgrass during the early spring, they completely eliminated the fine fuels that used to feed devastating wildfires. This allowed native perennial bunch grasses and deep-rooted shrubs to re-establish themselves. The economic and social impact on the surrounding human communities has been equally profound. Downstream from the canyon, local communities that once suffered from severe water quality issues due to agricultural runoff and massive erosion events have seen a dramatic stabilization of their water tables. The horse-engineered landscape acts as a massive natural water filtration plant, saving local municipalities hundreds of thousands of dollars in water treatment costs. A small, sustainable ecotourism industry has blossomed in the nearby gateway town, bringing clean revenue to a community that had been economically depressed since the decline of the local mining industry. The status of the canyon has officially shifted from a designated ecological wasteland to a vital, protected wildlife corridor. Humans have completely stepped back. There are no managed water pumps, no artificial plantings, and no fences dividing the terrain. The ecosystem is entirely self-sustaining, governed by the rhythm of wild hooves. But all of these metrics, the population growth, the vegetation recovery, the return of the birds, paled in comparison to what occurred in the late summer of 2024. This was the moment that completely reframed the entire project, leaving the scientific community in a state of absolute shock. For decades, ecological textbooks taught a fundamental, unshakable rule of nature. If you want to restore a broken, dried-out river system, you need beavers. Beavers are the ultimate wetland engineers. They build dams, slow the water down, raise the water table, and turn dry valleys into lush, carbon-sinking wetlands. Horses, on the other hand, were always classified strictly as consumers, animals that eat grass and move on. Nobody thought a horse could construct an aquatic ecosystem. Scientists assumed they simply lacked the behavioral capacity and the physical anatomy to manipulate water on a structural level. It had never been recorded in modern scientific literature. They were wrong. In July of 2024, a massive, historic cloudburst dropped 3 inches of rain onto the slick rock rims of the canyon in less than 2 hours. It was the exact type of weather event that usually spelt disaster for a recovering landscape. A wall of brown, chocolate-coloured water carrying thousands of tons of mud, boulders and debris came thundering down the main canyon channel. In the past, this flash flood would have violently ripped through the gorge, scouring out the vegetation, lowering the water table even further, and leaving behind a desolate trench of gravel. But Dr. Vance's team, monitoring the storm via remote trail cameras and water flow sensors, noticed something impossible on their data screens. Downstream from where the horses spent their summers, the velocity of the flash flood did not speed up. It dramatically slowed down. The water pressure dropped precipitously, and instead of rushing out of the canyon in a destructive torrent, the water lingered, spreading gently across the ancient, dry floodplain. When the storm passed and the researchers hiked into the canyon to investigate, they found a scene that defied explanation. The horses had not merely dug individual wells to drink from. Over the course of 3 years, the herd had systematically excavated dozens of interconnected wells along a 2-mile stretch of the dry creek bed. Because they consistently walked through these excavated zones, their heavy, 500-pound bodies had continuously compacted the underlying clay at the bottom of the pits, creating a series of impermeable, watertight bowls. When the flash flood hit, the heavy sediment and debris carried by the water got caught in the first few horse wells. The wells acted as natural sediment traps. As the debris piled up against the rims of the pits, it created a series of terraced, natural earth dams. The horses had inadvertently engineered a multi-tiered, stair-step wetland system. The water from the flood had been forced out of the deep arroyo and onto the surrounding valley floor, soaking into the dry soil like a giant sponge. The horses had done the work of a beaver colony, but they had done it using nothing but their hooves and their sheer weight. They had created a massive, living sponge that trapped millions of gallons of flash flood water, storing it safely underground where it could not evaporate. The entire scientific community was rocked by the revelation. What we thought was just a successful reintroduction of a wild animal was actually something much bigger. The reactivation of an ancient planetary life support system that had been dormant for 10,000 years. The definitive proof of this phenomenon was published in the prestigious international journal Environmental Research Letters in a landmark study detailing the hydroecological impact of equine well digging. The study proved mathematically that horse-engineered wells increase local surface water availability by up to 600% during times of extreme drought, acting as a crucial buffer against the catastrophic impacts of climate change. But while the scientific data provided indisputable credibility, the true emotional climax of this story occurred not in a laboratory, but in the hearts of the people who live along the canyon rims. For generations, the indigenous people of the region had carried a deep cultural ache for the loss of the canyon. To them, the degradation of the land was a reflection of a broken connection between humanity and the natural world. An elder of the local tribe, a man who remembered walking through the canyon as a young child before the diversion dam was built, visited the canyon floor shortly after the horse dams were discovered. He stood on the edge of a newly formed wetland, surrounded by tall green cattails and the vibrant songs of nesting red-winged blackbirds, a sight that had not been seen in that valley for over 70 years. He looked out at the herd of wild horses grazing peacefully on the far hillside, their manes blowing in the desert breeze. He explained that in his people's ancient oral traditions passed down through songs and stories for thousands of years, there was an old name for this specific chasm. Long before the white settlers named it Dead Canyon, it was known in their tongue as the place of the thunder hooves. The old stories spoke of a time when giant single-toed beasts would stamp the earth to make the rivers run when the Great Spirit forgot to send the rain. For over a century, that story had been dismissed by modern historians as mere myth, a poetic metaphor with no basis in ecological reality. But standing there, watching water seep from the hooves of 15 unwanted horses, the myth had become reality. The cultural memory had been vindicated. The land had remembered its caretakers, and the caretakers had returned the favour. When we look back at the journey of these 15 wild horses, we are forced to confront a profound shift in perspective. We did not artificially restore Dead Canyon. We did not plant the trees, we did not pump the water, and we did not build the dams. We simply returned the animal that knew how. We stepped out of the way and allowed a 10,000-year-old evolutionary relationship to resume its work. This story is not just an isolated miracle in a forgotten corner of the American West. It is a powerful, undeniable roadmap for the future of global conservation. It proves that nature is not a fragile, static museum piece that needs to be cordoned off and protected from change. It is a dynamic, resilient force that possesses an incredible capacity to heal itself if we only have the courage to trust the evolutionary intelligence of the wild creatures that share our planet. Across the globe, from the returning wolves of Chernobyl to the roaming bison of the European plains, the message of rewilding is loud and clear. The wild things do not just live on the earth, they create the earth. They are the guardians of our rivers, the builders of our soils, and the architects of our climate. What do you think about the incredible power of these wild horses? Do you believe we should trust nature to heal itself more often? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story inspiring, please hit the like button, share this video with someone who loves the wild, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dive nature documentary stories. The future of our planet depends on our willingness to look at the world through wild eyes, and together we can witness the return of the wild.